Hi, so today we're going to talk about the political economy of international trade. Free trade. This is the topic of this class, and following up on chapter 6, it's a hot topic among leaders of developed and developing countries around the world, especially last year, during the 2016 presidential elections. There was a heated debate about the pros and cons of the TPP, and we'll talk more about that in class. You'll recall from the discussion of trade theories in Chapter 6 that Smith, Ricardo, and Heckscher and Olin all supported the notion of free trade. But what does it really mean? Free trade refers to a situation where a government doesn't attempt to restrict what citizens can buy from another country or what they can sell to another country. Many nations claim to support free trade. For example, the US is one, but in reality, these countries, including the US, are only mostly nominally committed to free trade. They tend to intervene in international trade to protect the interests of politically important groups. For example, tariffs and subsidies have contributed to the dramatic rise in global food prices, and lots of countries levy tariffs on exports out of other countries because of their uh, their politicians having to cater to these politically important groups and their lobbying. So this is why they intervene in free trade. And so how do they intervene in free trade? Well, there are 7 main ways a country can intervene in the market in the market for free trade. So governments can implement tariffs or subsidies. They can set import quotas or voluntary export restraints. They can establish local content requirements or anti-dumping policies, or use administrative policies to make it more difficult for companies to engage in trade across countries. Let's talk about each of these. So imposing tariffs is the oldest and simplest way for governments to intervene in the market. And tariffs are the easiest type of trade barrier for the WTO or the World Trade Organization to limit. So, in fact, we've seen the number of tariffs fall in recent years, while other types of trade barriers have become more common, um, less conspicuous trade barriers. So, a tariff is a tax levied on imports that effectively raises the cost of imported products relative to domestic products. There are two kinds of tariffs. Specific tariffs are levied as a fixed charge for each unit of a good that's imported, and ad valorem tariffs are levied as a proportion of the value of the imported good. Um, so, for example, if you have if you import 600 tons of bananas and you charge um, $1,000, that's a specific tariff. Uh, if you charge $1,000 for each ton of bananas, that's a specific tariff. In fact, ad valorem tariff, as an example, would be if you charge, let's say, 5% of the value of the bananas imported. That would be ad valorem tariff. So why do governments implement tariffs? Well, tariffs are beneficial to governments because they increase revenues. They're also beneficial to domestic producers because tariffs provide protection against foreign competition by increasing the cost of imported foreign goods. This, however, means higher prices for consumers. In 2002, for example, the U.S. steel industry successfully lobbied Congress for protection from foreign imports. The U.S. put ad valorem tariffs of between 8 and 30% on all steel imports. As a result, the price of steel products in the US rose 30 to 50%, hurting not only consumers but also manufacturers of appliances, cars, and other products that use steel. So these producers claimed that the tariffs made it difficult to compete in the global market. Questions were raised as to whether the benefits the tariffs brought to the steel producers were worth the cost to the steel consumers. The tariffs were eventually revoked in 2003 when the WTO ruled that they violated free trade agreements. In any case, there is general agreement that tariffs are unambiguously pro-producer and anti-consumer, so they reduce the overall efficiency of the world economy because they encourage domestic producers to manufacture goods that could be produced more efficiently elsewhere. See what we talked about before in chapter 6 with the specialization and who should produce things if they produce it more efficiently. Well, here in this chapter, we're talking about all the things that make it that the theories in chapter 6 don't pan out. It's not that the most efficient producer produces things, because sometimes there are tariffs that make it, the less efficient. For example, steel producers in the US produce things even though they're not as efficient as steel producers elsewhere, but the tariffs make it so that they're protected from the more efficient competition overseas. Okay, let's move on to the next trade instrument, or the next instrument that governments use to intervene in free trade to make all the theories that we learned in chapter 6 useless, basically. Well, okay. This is Subsidies are simply government payments to domestic producers. So governments can give subsidies in various ways, including cash grants, low interest loans, and tax breaks. Subsidies can help domestic producers in two ways. They can help them compete against low-cost foreign imports, and they can help them gain export markets. One of the biggest recipients of subsidies in most countries is agriculture. In the US, for example, a 2002 bill designated that farmers were to receive $180 billion over 10 years. Japan is known for subsidizing its farmers. In other industries, subsidies tend to be lower, but they can be still significant. For example, subsidies in the commercial jet aircraft industry have been a source of controversy for years. So, do subsidies help producers be more competitive? Not necessarily. Instead, they tend to protect inefficient producers and promote excess production. In fact, one study showed that if developed countries eliminated their agricultural subsidies, we would see an increase in global trade in agricultural products and a savings of $160 billion. Keep in mind that consumers typically absorb the cost of subsidies. So, from the previous slide and this slide, we're beginning to see that with any instrument, there are winners and losers. Um, tend the winners tend to be certain producers of products, and the losers tend to be consumers overall, because they get to pay higher costs. Now let's look at import quotas and voluntary export restraints. An import quota is a direct restriction on the quantity of some good that may be imported into a country. In the US, for example, there is a quota on cheese imports. A tariff rate quota, which is common in agriculture, is a hybrid of a quota and a tariff, where a lower tariff is applied to imports within the quota than those over the quota. So, taking the banana example from before, if we have 500 tons of bananas being imported into the US, we'll say that the first 100 tons, there's a 5% tariff, and then anything above that 100 tons, there's a 10% tariff. That would be like a tariff rate quota. It's like a step function, right? Anything below something is cheaper. Anything, if you go over this threshold, you have to pay a higher price. This is to disincentivize lots of importing. Kind of goes along with the mercantilist philosophy that we learn about in chapter 6, and try to discourage imports into the country. Even though we don't deal with gold and silver anymore, it's still this tendency to think that the more that we export, it's better for a country, and the less we buy from other countries or import from other countries, the better it is for our country. Whether you agree with that is another discussion. So voluntary export restraints, or VERs, are quotas on trade imposed by the exporting country, usually at the request of the importing country's government. So a major example of this, in 1981, Japan established voluntary export restraints, VERs, for its auto industry. So you're probably wondering why a country would agree to limit its exports, because when a country export things, they earn a lot of money, right? So why would they volunteer to do this? It's because the country believes that if it doesn't, more damaging restrictions might be implemented by the country that is receiving these imports. So in this case, it would be the US. Japan believed that by setting its own limits, it could avoid potentially higher limits that could be set by the US. So they would just preempt the US and say, we're only going to export this number of Honda cars, for example. Because if it just flooded the US market with Hondas and Toyotas, the US might slap an even more restrictive quota, saying that you cannot export your cars to the US anymore. And a quota rent is the extra profit that producers like Honda and Toyota make when supply is artificially limited by an import quota. And so as an example, in 1981, due to the VERs, Japanese producers earned an extra 1 billion from the higher prices charged to consumers because of the trade barriers, the VERs that they established. So remember that import quotas and voluntary export restraints benefit domestic producers by limiting import competition, or the companies like Honda and Toyota, they limit these cars from coming to the US market, but they raise the price of imported goods. So again, somebody is suffering here, and it's consumers. Moving on to local content requirements and administrative trade policies. Local content requirements are another form of trade barrier, where the government demands that some specific fraction of a good be produced domestically. Like other types of trade restrictions, local content requirements benefit producers but not necessarily the consumers. For example, the Buy America Act requires government agencies to buy American products even if they're more expensive, and this is even unless unless the imports are significantly cheaper, you always have to buy American, and all of these costs are footed by the taxpayer. If you listen to the radio, there's another example I can give you. As I used to live in Canada, there's a Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and 50% of the content on the radio had to be Canadian. So any music played had to be Canadian artists like Celine Dion, Drake, who else is Canadian? Shania Twain. Before you can move on to like American artists. So local content requirement can be applied to products and services. Moving on to administrative trade policies. These are bureaucratic rules that are designated to make it difficult for imports to enter a country. So a lot of trade barriers fall into this basket of administrative trade policies. It's just like anything goes. You can get very creative with the ways that you can make it difficult for imports to get into your country. Japan, again, going back to the neo-mercantilist approach to free trade, right? Try to limit imports and maximize your exports. The Japanese are known for this type of trade barrier, which can be very frustrating for companies trying to break into the market. So, an example listed in the book is FedEx, which hasn't been able to expand into Japan because the Japanese government requires that every express package be opened to check for pornographic materials. Since the process can take several days, express packages are always delayed, so there's no point for FedEx to be there. As with other trade barriers, these policies hurt consumers by denying access to foreign products that may be superior to what's available at home. Okay, this next slide we're talking about anti-dumping policies. Dumping is defined as selling goods in a foreign market below their cost of production, or as selling goods in a foreign market at below their fair market value. Like say if you produced silicone chips in Taiwan or in South Korea or Taiwan for 20 cents a piece, and you're selling it in the US for that price, you'll be much below the um, the market cost, the market price in the US. You'll be selling your product at your cost, which is much below the cost that it takes to make it in the US. So it's viewed as a method by which firms unload excess production in foreign markets. And some dumping is considered to be predatory behavior where producers use the profits from their home country to subsidize prices in foreign markets with the goal of driving these indigenous competitors out of the market. And then later they would raise prices and earn substantial profits. So they might take a loss even, like they would sell their products here at below maybe even their cost because they've made so much, they've produced so much back at home, they don't even need to. If they don't sell it here, they're gonna dump. It's literally going to the garbage. So why don't they just sell it here for below the cost and drive the U.S. producers out of business? And once they're out of business, the consumers have nobody to buy from except them. And then when they're stuck with these foreign producers, they jack the prices up, and the consumers are again at a loss because then they're having to pay more than what they initially had to pay for this kind of product. So to stop this kind of behavior, countries implement anti-dumping policies or countervailing duties, which are designed to punish foreign firms that are dumping and protect domestic producers from this type of unfair competition. You can learn more about these policies by Googling what's happening in the anti-dumping policy realm. There's always foreign firms that are dumping things in the US because it's always cheaper to make, well, not always, but it's usually cheaper to make things overseas. The labor costs in the US are one of the highest in the world, labor costs and standards. So, if, by the way, if you are a US firm that is facing foreign competition, um, that are selling their products at below cost here, you would file a complaint with the Department of Commerce, and they will be the ones that impose the countervailing duties on these foreign producers. Essentially, it's like a tax, which makes it, which mandates that they have to increase their prices to bring the competition to a level playing field. So, if we know that from from trade theory that free trade is beneficial to countries, we learned this in chapter 6. Why do governments still intervene in the market? According to the textbook, governments intervene for political reasons and for economic reasons. Let's go over the political reasons first. These are concerned with protecting the interests of certain groups within a nation, normally producers, and usually at the expense of other groups like consumers, while economic arguments are typically concerned with boosting the overall wealth of a nation. There are 6 main political arguments for government intervention, including protecting jobs, protecting industries deemed important for national security, re- retaliating to unfair foreign competition, protecting consumers from dangerous products, furthering foreign policy goals, protecting the human rights of individuals in exporting countries. Let's look at each one more closely. The most common political reason for trade restrictions is protecting jobs and industries. And this is, most recently, we saw this in the presidential elections in 2016. Trump said that a lot of industries, especially in the Midwest, were being decimated by foreign competition. If you've traveled to cities in like states like Ohio, New York, a lot of unemployed people, factories abandoned, because what are they going to produce? The things that they produce will be outpriced by foreign competition. They can make things at such cheap cost that these jobs and companies can no longer exist in the U.S. So and if you don't have a job, what are you going to eat? And so so these people will be eventually what they're voters, and if you don't let voters eat and live, you're not going to stay in power. So these politicians, so this is why this is the main reason for establishing trade restrictions. The unions will pressure politicians, and the industries that are threatened by more efficient farm producers and that have more political clout than the consumers who will eventually pay for the intervention, they will lobby the government. So we recall the tariffs that were placed on the steel imports in 2002. Not only did these tariffs protect U.S. steel workers against more efficient foreign producers, they also helped curry favor with politically important states. that President Bush needed to win his bid for re-election in 2014. Usually, these politicians need to make sure that especially the states, the swing states, they need all the votes in these states, so they need to make sure these people have enough food on the plate. Literally, if you look at countries like Greece, people are going to food banks. They're lining up for at soup kitchens because they're out of a job, and that's for later chapters. But due to the cuts, right, in the European Union, um, the cuts in the public sector, a lot of hospitals, schools, police stations, public institutions, the budget cuts are leading to job cuts, are leading to very, very hungry people, and um, it's a real issue. So this is what, and politicians know this, so they will try to protect domestic industries and jobs. Second, national security is another common argument for government intervention in the market. Governments claim that it's sometimes necessary to protect certain industries in case of war. So aerospace, defense-related industries may receive some protection based on this rationale. In 1986, for example, the US government subsidized Sematech, a major producer of semiconductors, using this argument. Um, but it's kind of fuzzy. What is an industry that's related to national security? Um, a lot of industries can have indirect or a kind of a tenuous connection with national security. The third reason, retaliation. Sometimes governments intervene in markets to retaliate against moves made by other governments. China and the US, always in trade wars. And maybe you've heard this in the news. China has been under fire in recent years for failing to take proper steps against product piracy, and many countries have threatened to implement trade barriers um, against China, against these products from China if the practice isn't stopped. China initially responded to the threats with threats of increasing its own barriers to trade, um, like not importing U.S. cars, for example, but it has since backed off. Governments also claim that trade barriers are sometimes necessary to protect consumers. So this is the fourth reason. In the US, for example, a ban on imports of certain assault weapons was put in place in the 90s. The European Union has limited imports of hormone-treated beef for many years, and this has been a source of huge conflict between the EU and the US. Um, you can imagine during the mad cow disease years, the US wouldn't import beef from the UK, from Europe, and this is to protect consumers. So, um, and toys from China, same thing, to protect consumers. Uh, Going on to number 5, intervention. Governments sometimes argue uh, is necessary to support their foreign policy objectives. So using trade as like a instrument to influence other countries. For example, a country might extend favorable trade terms to a country that is trying to build a relationship with, or implement policies designed to punish countries. You've probably been familiar with some of the trade embargoes the US maintains against countries like Cuba and North Korea, these communist countries that have political ideologies and policies that are again are at odds with the ones in the US. Keep in mind, however, that just because one country has implemented these embargoes, it doesn't mean that other countries have. An embargo is where we don't import what they produce, so they have um, they lose a market in us. They can't export their goods to our country. They lose out on these revenues. So here we're saying that um, just because you don't buy their goods doesn't mean that every other country in the world doesn't. For example, in the case of Cuba, other countries like Germany and Canada stepped in where the US left. The US passed the Helms-Burton Act in 96 to try to prevent foreign companies from using assets that were confiscated from American companies during the 1959 revolution. And a similar act, the Amato Act, tried to prevent the same thing from happening in Libya and Iran. But these acts have very little effect because um, the US doesn't have much say in what companies from other countries are doing outside of the US. This is kind of going back to this unilateral versus multilateral thing. The US can say, uh, we don't let our companies bribe in other countries using the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. But other countries, like companies from other countries, can bribe in, for example, India and China, um, because they don't have a thing called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So this really puts US companies on an unlevel playing field with companies from other countries, because if they're bribing and we cannot bribe, how are we going to get the deal, right? Uh, so, but that's another discussion. Let's move on to number 6, which is protecting human rights. This is another argument used by governments that intervene in the market. The basic idea is that the best way to change human rights practices in a country is to encourage it to trade. This will arguably increase income levels, which generally means that human rights practices improve. For many years, the US debated annually whether to extend most favored nation status to China, which would give China preferential trade terms with the US. China gained automatic most favored nation status in 2001 when it joined the World Trade Organization. Um, Ecuador's flower industry is concerned that the preferential trading terms that have been in place for 15 years will come to an end. These were negotiated as part of a multinational agreement designed to help the region move away from the drug trade and it helped Ecuador to develop a thriving flower business. So about 70% of the flowers grown in Ecuador are exported to the US. But in 2006, Bush signed a bill to end the terms. This could result in significant job loss, especially for women. Um, so the thing with this last point is that a lot of countries have very questionable practices with respect to human rights, like fisheries. You can any industry you can name, there's going to be abuse. Fisheries in Indonesia, textile companies in Bangladesh, lots of abuse in Cambodia, for example, even Malaysia, right? So um, this argument would say, okay, let's not import products made in these countries, because if we do, we're just reinforcing the abuse of human capital, of human labor. But another argument would say, by buying products from these countries, we raise the overall wealth of these countries, which would lead the companies in these countries to treat their employees better. So it's like a chicken and egg argument. Now let's turn to the economic arguments for intervention. Governments typically use two key economic arguments to justify their intervention in free trade. The first is the infant industry argument, and the second is the strategic trade policy. Let's look at each more closely. The infant industry argument suggests that an industry should be protected until it can develop and be a viable and competitive industry on the global scale. One of the arguments with this argument, like I mentioned in the podcast for chapter 6, is that determining when an industry has grown up enough to stop the government support. So where do we cut off the training wheels, right? In fact, many people believe that protecting these industries is really no different than sponsoring the development of inefficient industries. So the rationale here is that if they're efficient enough, they won't need the government support. They can get off to speed immediately with the consumers buying their products or banks financing their needs instead of having basically free money from the government. So let's go back to the question of whether free trade is beneficial for countries. While many people have argued unequivocally for free trade, recall that new trade theory argues that there may be justification for intervention. Paul Krugman, who we talked about in chapter 6, he developed free trade theory, by the way. He argued that strategic trade policies that are designed to establish domestic firms in dominant positions in the global market will probably result in retaliation because these firms have the backing of their home governments. If they get thrusted onto the world market, other governments will have to help out their firms in these industries in order to be on a level playing field. So this is the retaliation that we're talking about. When the European Union provided, for example, $15 billion in subsidies to Airbus, the US naturally had to take steps to protect Boeing. In the end, these subsidies probably canceled each other out, and consumers and taxpayers footed the bill. Krugman also argued that since special interest groups in a country tend to influence governments that want their support on critical issues, government policies on trade don't always support national interests. They may be hijacked by certain lobbyists, for example, certain industries. So there's always politics going on. The policies adopted by the European Union to protect consumers from imported agricultural products probably did nothing more than protect inefficient farmers and politicians who relied on the farm vote and to cause consumers to pay for more food. So this is what the textbook says about tariffs and trade intervention. And it says that protectionism is in general very bad. It leads to higher prices for consumers. Let's talk more about this in class. There's always two sides to any one coin. There's always a double-edged sword. What exactly are the benefits of intervention? What are the cons to intervention? Okay, I'll see you guys in class.